Before 1914, Adolf Hitler was nobody. A failed art student sleeping in a Vienna homeless shelter, turned down twice by the Academy of Fine Arts, drifting through his mid-20s with no money, no career, no future, and no direction. He was 25 years old and had achieved nothing. Then a war started, and everything changed. When Germany mobilized for war in August 1914, Hitler later wrote that he fell to his knees and thanked heaven. He was an Austrian citizen living in Munich, which technically meant he should have served in the Austrian army. He had already dodged Austrian military service the year before by failing a medical examination. But in the patriotic fever of August 1914, he wrote a personal petition to King Ludwig III of Bavaria, begging to be allowed to enlist in the Bavarian army instead. Astonishingly, the request was granted. On August 16, 1914, Hitler enlisted in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, a unit that would become known as the List Regiment after its first commanding officer, Colonel Julius List. He was assigned as a dispatch runner, a Meldegänger, carrying messages between regimental headquarters and the front lines. His first taste of real combat came on October 29, 1914, at the First Battle of Ypres in Belgium. The List Regiment was thrown into battle against elite British professional soldiers with almost no fire support, no helmets, and inadequate training. In the first 20 days of fighting, the regiment was effectively destroyed as an offensive force. Of approximately 3,600 men who entered combat, only around 600 came out. Colonel List himself was killed. A bullet tore through Hitler's right sleeve in the very first day of battle. Every single man around him in the initial advance fell dead or wounded. Hitler survived, by what soldiers called luck, and what he would later call destiny. He remained calm under fire, followed orders without question, and carried messages through shell fire with a consistency that impressed his superiors. In December 1914, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class for dragging a wounded comrade to safety under enemy fire. He was promoted to Gefreiter, the equivalent of Lance Corporal, a rank he would hold for most of the war. His superiors respected him but noted something unusual. He had no interest in returning home. While other soldiers counted the days until leave, Hitler spent his leave periods near the regiment. When asked why he never went home, he reportedly replied that he had no home to return to. The army was the first community he had ever truly belonged to. He fought in some of the worst battles of the Western Front. The Battle of the Somme in 1916, where on October 7 a shell exploded at the entrance to his dispatch runner's dugout, and a splinter struck him in the left thigh. He was evacuated to the Red Cross Hospital at Belitz. True to character, he wrote to his commanding officer asking to be recalled to the front before he had fully recovered. The request was granted, and he returned to the regiment in March 1917. He fought through the grinding artillery battles of 1917 and into the final German offensives of 1918. In August 1918, he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, Germany's highest battlefield decoration for enlisted men, for personally capturing a group of French soldiers hiding in a shell crater while carrying a message alone across enemy territory. The Iron Cross First Class was rarely given to someone of his rank. His regimental adjutant, Hugo Gutmann, who recommended him for the award, was Jewish, a fact that would later cause Gutmann considerable danger. Then came the night of October 13–14, 1918. Hitler and his unit were positioned near Wervik in Belgium when a British gas bombardment struck their position in the early morning hours. The gas was mustard gas. Within hours, Hitler's eyes had swollen shut. He was temporarily blind, stumbling through the dark, led by a comrade back behind the lines. He was evacuated first to Flanders for initial treatment, then transferred to the military hospital at Passwalk in Pomerania to recover. He was lying in that hospital bed, bandages over his eyes, unable to see, when a pastor came to the ward on November 10, 1918, and told the patients that Germany had lost the war. The Kaiser had abdicated. Revolution had broken out across Germany. The government had signed an armistice. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Hitler's reaction, as he described it in Mein Kampf, was total collapse. He wrote that everything went black before his eyes again. He staggered back to his ward, threw himself on his bed, and buried his head in his blankets. He had not wept since his mother's death in 1907. He wept now. 4 years of surviving everything the Western Front could throw at him. 2 Iron Crosses, a wound, a gas attack, and it ended with this. Not a battlefield defeat. A surrender signed by politicians while the army was still in the field. He was discharged from Passwalk on November 19, 1918, 8 days after the armistice. He returned to Munich. What he found was a city in revolution. The Bavarian monarchy had been overthrown. A short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic had been declared and then brutally suppressed. The streets were full of defeated soldiers, unemployed workers, political agitators, and hungry families. Germany had gone from imperial power to economic ruin in the space of weeks. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, made everything worse. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for starting the war under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. It was stripped of 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Its army was reduced to 100,000 men. It was forbidden from having an air force. And it was presented with a reparations bill of 132 billion gold marks, a sum so vast it would not be fully paid off until 2010. The German people experienced Versailles not as a peace treaty, but as a national humiliation, a punishment imposed by enemies on a country that had been told by its own government it was winning the war right up until the moment it surrendered. Into this atmosphere of defeat, humiliation, and economic collapse fell the idea that would define the next 15 years of European history. The stab in the back, the Dolchstoßlegende. The theory held that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield. The German army had been undefeated, the theory claimed, and had been betrayed from within by Jewish financiers, Marxist revolutionaries, and cowardly politicians who had surrendered when victory was still possible. The theory was false. Historians unanimously reject it. Germany's military position in 1918 was collapsing. The Hindenburg Line had been broken. The army was exhausted and demoralized. American troops were arriving in enormous numbers. Defeat was inevitable, and the German military high command knew it. But the theory was powerful because it was simple, because it gave a humiliated people someone to blame, and because it was promoted by some of Germany's most respected military figures, including Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg himself, who testified before a parliamentary committee in November 1919 that revolutionary forces had sabotaged the army from within. Hitler absorbed all of it. He had served 4 years at the front. He had fought at Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele, and Arras. He had watched his regiment lose over 2,000 men. He had been gassed and blinded, and then politicians had surrendered. To him it was not a theory. It was a fact he had lived, and the people he held responsible were not abstract enemies. He would later claim in Mein Kampf that his anti-Semitism had crystallized during his years in Vienna before the war, but historians note that his wartime letters contain no significant anti-Semitic content, and that his virulent public anti-Semitism emerged clearly only in 1919, shaped by the defeat, the revolution, and the political atmosphere of post-war Munich. In the spring of 1919, Hitler was still in the Bavarian army. Without family, without money, without any civilian prospects, he had nowhere else to go. The army gave him work as a political agent, monitoring fringe political groups in Munich for signs of revolutionary activity. It was in this capacity, in September 1919, that he attended a meeting of a tiny nationalist group called the German Workers' Party. He intended only to observe. Instead, he got into an argument, impressed people with his ability to speak, and was invited to join. He accepted. The party had 54 members. Within 2 years, he would be its undisputed leader and the most dangerous political orator in Germany. The rest is history in the darkest possible sense of that phrase. By 1921, he had taken over the German Workers' Party, renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In November 1923, during the catastrophic hyperinflation crisis when a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks, he attempted to seize power in Munich in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed. He was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 9 months. During those 9 months in Landsberg prison, he dictated Mein Kampf, the book that laid out in full the ideology he had been building since 1919, extreme nationalism, violent anti-Semitism, the Lebensraum doctrine of German territorial expansion, and an absolute conviction that Germany's humiliation had been caused by a Jewish Marxist conspiracy and could only be reversed by a strong leader willing to destroy that conspiracy at its root. The World War did not merely give Hitler his politics, it gave him his identity, his grievances, his mythology, and his audience. Before 1914, he was an obscure failed artist with no voice and no followers. The war gave him a cause, the defeat gave him a villain, the chaos of the post-war years gave him a stage, and the humiliation of an entire nation gave him a crowd that was ready to listen. In 1941, 13 years after he had seized power, Hitler wrote that from his experiences at the front, he had built his National Socialism. He was not wrong about that. He was wrong about almost everything else, but the war made him, and in making him, it set the world on a course toward a second catastrophe, even greater than the first.